Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be back in Tbilisi, and it's wonderful to be back in this intellectually exciting environment. Last time I was here in October, I came for a talk by an Hungarian scholar, who talked about Johan Lundblad, and I realized I had given one of my own lectures at Uppsala University, and I realized that this is a truly exciting intellectual place to be. Now, today I will be presenting an argument about the emasculation of the god of heaven in Greek myth, yet with implications, I think, for the understanding of other texts, other sources, and other societies as well. So, thanks so much to Tbilisi State University, to the Institute, and for all of you for coming. And particularly to Irina Varchia, who invited me. Right, I will be talking about the emasculation of heaven in Greek myth, and I will be making the argument that there is a slightly eccentric connection between a number of phenomena that we don't usually think about as being connected. So I will be making the argument that it is the sickle of Kronos is connected to a number of things that previous scholarship hasn't really thought about. Let's begin. Now, this is Hesiod, and Hesiod is our main man today. Hesiod, this is a representation to be found in Naples. Hesiod was a Greek poet, you know that, and he lived in the 8th century or the 7th century, but some people argue that he never lived at all, that it is simply a poetic persona. That's fine, I don't take a stand on that at the moment. But what I do find interesting about Hesiod is that there are certain features in his poems that are truly astonishing. Now, I will be making an argument about the weapon with which the god Kronos castrates, emasculates his father Uranus. And I will be asking two questions about this fictional object. The first one is, what is it made of? The second is, why is it serrated? Why is it toothed? And these questions may seem superfluous, but my contention is that they do, well, the potential answers reveal certain things about Greek and other ancient societies that should be of interest to us. Now, just to recall, there is a divine succession according to Hesiod, and the first god who rules over the universe is Uranus, the god of heaven. He is then emasculated by his son Kronos, and Kronos eats his children and is then forced to vomit them by his son Zeus. And Zeus is the final ruler of the universe. So this is the divine succession. Now, the emasculation is how shall I put it, a juicy element in Greek myth and in Hesiod, and one would have thought that Greek artists would have been interested in presenting it. This is not the case. This is a 16th century painting, Giorgio Vasari. It's now in Naples or Rome. He was from Arezzo. In any case, here we see the young Kronos castrating his father, not with a sickle, but with a scythe, which is anachronistic because the Greeks hadn't invented the scythes. The scythes are pretty much the same tool, yet with a long handle. Now, for Greek visual artists, this was not something that they depicted. This is one of the depictions of Kronos that we see, is Kronos, Rhea, and a baby, and he seems to be, well, about to devour one of them. Now, to begin with, I want to point out that this myth, this Greek myth, and this myth in Hesiod has an important parallel or prefiguration in Hittite and Hurrian myths that were transmitted in Anatolia, and most scholars nowadays think, well, they're pretty certain that the myth as found in Hesiod is profoundly inspired by other versions, the Hittite and the Hurrian ones being some of these. Now, in the originally Hurrian myth, which has come down to us in Hittite texts, that is in Hittite versions, the god Kumarbi becomes master of the universe by castrating his predecessor, the god of heaven, Anu. And he bites off the genitals. So he bites them off, and then Anu, the god of heaven, says, "Don't be so happy because I've just impregnated you. You are now pregnant." So the unlucky Kumarbi then gives birth to what will become his successor. Now, the Hittite civilization was found in Bronze Age Anatolia, and this is it on the map. The Hurrians lived in a number of different kingdoms, but the most important of which was probably Mitanni, which was likewise a Bronze Age civilization. It doesn't mean that it was Hurrian through and through. There are indications that, as in most cases, it was multi-ethnic. We When we look at the Hesiodic text, we see something, I think, remarkable. Now, we hear that Kronos reached out from his ambush. That is, Kronos wants to emasculate his father, to topple his father, to oust his father from the throne. And he reached out from his ambush with his left hand, and with his right hand he grabs the monstrous sickle, long and jagged-toothed, and eagerly he reaped the genitals from his dear father, or from his father, basically, and threw them behind him to be borne away. Now, this is interesting, I think, in so many ways. But let's begin with one thing. Where does the sickle come from? The sickle is invented by Gaia, the earth goddess, precisely for the purpose of ousting the ruler of the universe, Uranus, her husband, as we usually say. And so she invents something with which Kronos emasculates his father. What is this something? Now, this is Glenn Most's translation, and if we look at the material out of which the sickle is made, we hear that it is genos poliou adamantos, and Most translates it in his local translation as an offspring of grey adamant. But genos, of course, is an interesting word, because genos can mean a number of different things. It can be a sort, it can be a genus, it can be a species. And this is, in the Greek context, really strange, because at this point, in archaic literature, and later, genos is never used of, is always used of living beings. So the material, this adamant, is somehow connected to living beings. Now later, in Theophrastus, for instance, we find, that is in scientific prose, ancient scientific prose, we find Theophrastus, for example, speaking about the different kinds of minerals and stones and so on, as being gene, as being a genos. But at this point, and for several hundred years, genos is about something that is living. So this is, the expression is off, it's strange, it's eccentric. It's as if Hesiod is signaling that there's something living in this material. So what is the adamant? Now, damas, nowadays, it's probably in all likelihood, a Semitic word, a loan word, a word for a kind of stone, but we have extremely good reason to believe that the Greeks heard the words untamable and unconquerable are damas. So damatsu is to tame something, and ar is, of course, the negation of it. So what is untamable and unconquerable, that is what is invincible, that is adamas. And later, in Theophrastus, for instance, we find the word meaning diamond, and also of a poisonous plant which is called henbane. This is what we find in Dioscorides, the botanist. But adamas, at this point, what does it mean? What does it mean for Hesiod, and what does it mean for his audience? Now, there are two previous interpretations. The first of them is that it means iron or steel. The second is that it means some kind of mythic metal that only the gods have access to. So it's either iron or steel, and there's an image of iron or steel. Actually, it's steel, but in any case, as you know, steel is an alloy. It's iron plus something else that will make it more durable, robust, and so on. That's the first interpretation. The second interpretation is that, I'm not sure if you ever watched Marvel movies. You do? I'm so.
I love
horror
movies.
And you do too. Thanks. I'm so glad to hear that. Sometimes people don't watch Marvel movies and they don't realise that I'm actually interacting with popular culture. Now, in the Marvel cinematic universe, there is this mythical metal called adamantium, and then there's another one called vibranium. And these don't exist in the real world, but in the Marvel cinema.
Wolverine's claws are from adamant.
Exactly, Wolverine, so Wolverine's claws and skeletons made of adamantium. Well, so this is the second interpretation, that it's a completely fictitious metal. Now, do we need another interpretation? Well, I think if we take the first interpretation seriously, then this would more or less be the model for Kronos sickle. This is an iron sickle from Keranikos in Athens, and this would be one model. Now, this is a modern sickle that I found in the countryside when I was supposed to mow something. So this would be one possibility. This is an iron sickle. But there is a problem with this. And that is that there are some scholars, many scholars, who believe that the myth about the god with the sickle is so much older than the Iron Age, and it's so much older than the use of iron itself. So, we need to ask ourselves, is it possible that adamant has that there is another model, that there is another historical background for adamant? Now, if we look at older sickles, we can find things like these. This is from the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. It's from Thera, Akrotiri, and Santorini, and this is a sickle from the Bronze Age. Now, this doesn't fit in with Hesiod's text, because the argument for making this is that in the Hurrian and Hittite myths, we hear, or rather in the Hittite texts, we learn that the tool which first separated heaven and earth was made of copper. So we see the Sumerian determinative urudu, signifying that this is made of copper. Now, if we take this seriously, then this means that this cannot be the model for the Kronos sickle, because Kronos sickle is grey, and a copper sickle or a bronze sickle is either green or, well, copper colored, the way it is when it isn't oxidized. So that doesn't work. The question is then, is there another historical model that could be relevant for chronosicle? I believe that one possibility is of looking toward another source. Now, obsidian is a mineral that is, it's a volcanic glass that was used for cutting tools, not only in the Neolithic period, not only in the Bronze Age, but actually for a very long time. Archaeologists excavating Haliais in Argolis in Greece have found elements of what must be elements of obsidian sickles in the classical period. So this is after Hesiod. And this means, I think, that there is the possibility that there is a culture of memory and a living memory in Hesiod's time of sickles made where the blade was made of obsidian. And this is obsidian from Melos. It's black, so one or two of you have already thought that this doesn't fit in with chronosicle because it's not grey. Now, this is a reconstruction that I studied on Melos a year ago, two years ago, and it's a reconstruction by a man who was obsessed with obsidian on Melos and who went around the island collecting obsidian and obsidian objects. And this is one reconstruction of a sickle with a wooden frame with obsidian elements. So I would argue that this is one possibility. Now, we know that the Hurrian and the Hittite myths and so on, that, well, we know, but many scholars believe that the one place of origin is Lake Van in northern Anatolia, in present-day Turkey. And this is a highly volcanic area with massive assets, resources of obsidian. So obsidian might be relevant not only to Hesiod, but also to the older versions of the myth. Now the question is, why would one use a Stone Age tool? And I've already answered that. It was not just a Stone Age tool. It was people kept using obsidian elements in cutting instruments for a very long time. And this is actually done to this day. Some surgeons like to use obsidian scalpels because they are incredibly sharp. So let's keep this idea in mind. What if the sickle of Kronos is actually made of obsidian? There's one final piece of, I wouldn't call it evidence, but there is a really dodgy, weird and late compilation, a book of sorts, about stones and magic called the Kyranides. And in that book, we hear that obsidian is Kronos stone. Oxianos esti de chrono. I wouldn't stress this piece of evidence too much because that book is so full of magic and superstition and it's overfull of this kind of correlations. But I would just point it out. And this is obsidian from Melos. And if one cuts it thinly, then it's not really black. It's grey, just like Kronos sickle. And this is my hand, because when I was looking for obsidian on Melos, I cut my hand. And it does show that obsidian is sharp. Now, then there's another thing that I find even more interesting, and that is that in the linguistic proximity to adamant in Greek sources, we find in a number of different genres, a number of different texts. We find a connection between dogs and teeth and mouths, curved shapes, and the sickle. I will make this argument. Of course I can't present all the sources, and this is a really work in progress, so I really hope no one is, recording this or posting it online, because that was a joke. Right. Well, in any case, Hesiod tells us that Kronos sickle is a harpen karcharodonta. It's a toothed sickle. And this is one way of interpreting or translating it. Now, the question is, why is it serrated? Why does it have teeth? Why is it toothed? This is a bad thing for a weapon, because it gets stuck if you cut someone with it, if you strike someone with it, it gets stuck in the armor, or in the clothes, or in the flesh, or possibly in the bones if you penetrate really far. So it's a bad thing for a weapon, but it's a good thing for an agricultural tool. Martin Persson Nilsson, a Swedish scholar and ancient historian, argued that this was one indication that Kronos was actually an agricultural deity. Now, in the Greek visual arts, we find people or entities, figures, who have cut off members of other individuals by using sickles. This is Perseus, for instance, and on this hydra in the British Museum, we do see that the sickle is actually toothed, despite the fact that it would have been inconvenient. So why is it serrated? Why is it toothed? Now, karcharodonta derives from the word tooth, and there are so many cognates in European languages. So we know that this is actually literally a tooth. It's a sharp-toothed sickle. Now, the metaphor of saying that a tool is toothed is very old. We find it in Mycenaean Greek, where there is the word odatu, toothed. So it's not strange to say that something is toothed. What is strange is the insistence with which Hesiod and others talk about toothed things. Now, the first thing to ask is, does karcharodus mean that the tooth itself is serrated or toothed? And this is quite rare in the animal kingdom. This is this is a kind of shark, the blue shark, that actually has serrated teeth. Most sharks and most animals don't have serrated teeth. And I brought a shark tooth just to be on the safe side. So I'll pass it around. As you can see, this shark tooth is not serrated itself. So could Hesiod have known about the blue shark? Well, it lives very deep, and Hesiod didn't like sailing and he didn't like swimming, so this is probably not the case. So I think we should think about the word karcharodus as meaning that the blade itself is toothed. So kar is something that is cutting, something that is sharp, and it may actually help us in some ways, because in ancient Greek sources we find a kind of shark that is called karcharias. And this is, of course, the modern scientific name for sharks. But this kind of shark is actually called karcharias, or a saw-toothed dog. So, and this is defined by Hesiod in his lexicon as being a thalassios kupon. So, most of these sources are comedy, I don't know how much we should make of this, but I think it is interesting to find that a certain species of shark is spoken of as being karch, as in karcharodus, and it is spoken of as being a dog. Moreover, I think, so in short, I think there is a sort of connection between dogs, sharks, teeth. Now, what is even more interesting to my mind is, in my opinion, is that karcharodus, when we find it elsewhere in early Greek literature, really has a wonderful and truly interesting conceptual career. In Homer, we find it twice, both times of an animal's teeth. If Homer is in fact older than Hesiod, then this should be of interest to us. If it's not, then it should be of interest anyway. In Hesiod, we find the word 5 times. Karcharodus, it's in the Theogony, twice of Kronos' sickle, and then we find it 3 times of an animal's teeth. Now, moving on through history, we are already in the 5th century, and in Aeschylus, in one of his fragments, we found karcharodus used of an animal's teeth. In Bacchylides, we find it used of an animal's teeth. And then finally, in Aristophanes, there are 3 instances of this word, and karcharodus, jagged tooth, sawtooth, whatever, is only used of an animal's teeth. Which animal? Well, it's not this animal, because this is what happens afterwards. After Aristophanes, Aristotle uses it a great number of times, and this is a completely new direction in the conceptual career of karcharodus, because Aristotle introduces the word as a technical term to denote an animal's jaw, the jaws of an animal in which there are sharp teeth that do not rub up against each other. So he speaks of the jaws, the teeth of crocodiles and lions, for instance. And if this beautiful croc would close his mouth and show us the teeth, we would see that the teeth don't rub against each other. They are perfectly fitted. So this is a scientific term introduced by Aristotle, and it's a new direction. But what should be of interest to us is this: in all of these cases, in all of extant Greek literature before Aristotle, it's only used a Kronos sickle on the one hand and an animal on the other one. Which animal? Well, I mean, you guessed it. It's this animal. It's a dog. It's only used of dogs. So there appears to be a connection, a nexus, between, on the one hand, teeth, on the other hand, dogs, and on the sort of monstrously impossible third hand, Kronos' sickle. There's a conceptual net here. There's a connection that we should, I think, that we should want to understand and want to discover. So this is part of my mythological field work. I met a dog and I asked him politely to open his mouth and show his teeth, and he sort of did, but then he got upset, and the second photo was not at all as good as the first one, and the first one was probably not really, but you get the point, I think. The point of this is that there is some sort of connection between what is, well, teeth, mouths, sickles, dogs, and, at least by extension, certain sharks. So, we move over to Eglisi, right? Well, we move over to Eglisi. I have a hard time. I always have to think, is it a B or is it a G in the Georgian alphabet? In any case, so if we move over to Apollonius of Rhodes, we find some really interesting scenes at the end of Book 3 and the beginning of Book 4. So this is from Apollonius of Rhodes, and I won't spend too much time talking about it, and I won't present the textual evidence either, because it is, in my view, massive. What we find in the scenes where Jason prepares for the battle against the earthborn men and for sowing the dragon's teeth and for employing the oxen, the monstrous fire-breathing oxen. There we find that Jason uses a plough that is made of adamant. And this is interesting. Again, I want to point out that I'm not saying that the Greeks would have identified unequivocally adamant with obsidian. My contention, well, my suspicion perhaps, is that the Greeks, in the back of their minds or in the back of their cultural and agricultural history, there would have been the memory of obsidian sickles. In this case, we find that the plough is made of adamant. And of course you can't make a plough, you can't make that kind of agricultural instrument of obsidian. It doesn't make sense. But adamant itself, in a great number of texts, in Hesiod and in other places, appears to be connected to things that are curved, just like a chronosicle, to teeth, to mouths, to dogs. And in Apollonius, we find that this plough is made of adamant. We find that Apollonius insistently speaks of the helmet or the cap of Jason, and this helmet is then called a knee. Knee is a pretty normal word for a helmet or a cap, but it derives from kuon, that is dog, because originally they were made of dog's skin. And later one would speak of, well, other things that were definitely not made of dog's skin, but one would speak of them as being kunee. When the earthborn emerge from the earth, we hear that they are karchalioi. They are like, well, they are like sharp-teethed kunes. So they are like sharp-teethed kunes. And then there are a great number of other images with dogs. Jason then bends at several times. He bends his knees and he bends behind his shield, I think. And the earthborn, the giants, they grow like plants. And Jason then throws stones. He mows, which is amma, or which is precisely the verb used by Hesiod when talking about the emasculation of Kronos. And he does this precisely with a bent sickle, harben efkampe. So there's adamant, and there's bending, and there's harvesting, and then there are this insistent pattern of images with dogs' teeth and mouths. Now, I believe that this is significant, and if we read the pseudo-Hesiodic shield of Heracles, we find that there's likewise a scene that is truly strange, in my view. Heracles puts on a helmet made of adamant, and then there's a sort of almost psychedelic series of images where the poet uses images pertinent to curved shapes, to teeth, to mouths, to dogs, and then to certain, what may be certain word plays that allude to dogs, despite the fact that they actually mean black. So, I would argue, I would cautiously argue, and again, this is really work in progress. It's a book will write, not at some point, but soon. In any case, I would argue that there is a pervasive pattern in which, in Greek literature, sickles, dogs, mouths, teeth are connected, and the curved shape. Now, the question is, what can we do with this? Well, I would argue that what we can do is a sort of cognitive mapping, that for the Greeks, and again, I'm not saying that this is what they wouldn't necessarily have thought of, that they used it in a self-conscious, or that they were aware of this convention. In some cases, there's a magical papyrus that I find truly interesting, in which we find adamant and the curved shape, and dogs, and so on. There, I wouldn't draw any conclusions about the intention of the author. So, but the connection, the nexus between these different things, I would argue, is present in those Greek texts. In some cases, as in Apollonius, it might have been done in a very self-conscious manner, as a poet thinking about his models, thinking about Hesiod. That's a possibility. So we can, I think, discover the Greek connection between sickles, dogs, teeth, mouths, curved shapes, possibly sharks, and then possibly adamant, and possibly that, and not possibly adamant, but maybe that means obsidian. That's the cognitive mapping, but we're not really done yet. The question is, do we want to explain this concatenation of different things? Now, when people give courses in the methodology of the historical or the social sciences, most teachers then say that it's not better or more refined to explain something causally than describing it. So we don't have to causally or whatever explain everything. In my view, the connection, the nexus between these different things is, well, I find it interesting. I hope you do. In any case, if we want to look for an explanation, I think we can either look to an internal explanation or an external one. And the internal one would be Greek. And that would be that for most Greeks, the everyday experience or the overwhelming experience of something that was curved and that was indented, that is toothed, would have been two different things. The first one would have been the sickle, used everywhere, offered at temples and shrines and sanctuaries and so on, but also naturally used in agriculture. And then the second thing would be the teeth of a dog, that is the jaw of a dog. So, my contention would be, my guess, my hypothesis would be that this would have been the everyday experience in Greek societies of something that is curved and something that is toothed. But we don't only have to look at an internal explanation. I think we can look at something that is external as well. And that would be a Hurrian or Hittite explanation. And I said that last time I came here, there was this great Hungarian scholar who spoke about Johan Lundblad, and he said, I come here as a complete imposter because I don't read Georgian. And it was everyone was spellbound. It was a great evening. I come here as an amateur, well, in Hittite things, and as a complete imposter, not imposter even, because I don't even pretend when it comes to Hurrian things. Because I don't read Hurrian, I try to read Hittite. Now, what would then be the explanation be if we look to these other societies, these older societies? Now, I think it is important to note that in the older version of this castration and emasculation myth, we find Kumarbi not castrating, emasculating his predecessor with a toothed sickle, but with another toothed, well, instrument, namely his own jaw. So he bites it off with his own teeth. And this is unequivocally so in the Hittite text. If we look then further on, we find another parallel to Greek mythology or Greek myth, because Kumarbi wants to eat a baby, and he is then tricked into instead eating a stone. But he doesn't swallow it, he bites into it. And what I find interesting in the Hittite text here is that it insistently, in a marked fashion, it points to the teeth of Kumarbi. So this can be basalt, or it can be diorite. Na is the determinative for a stone, and kunkunutsi. I thought I misspelled it for a second, but I didn't. Well, in kunkunutsi, so the text is heavily damaged, and I would be cautious with regard to drawing any conclusions. And at the same time, I would point out there is the stone, the kunkunutsi stone, which might be diorite, basalt, and this stone does something with Kumarbi in his mouth, and it does precisely something with his teeth. And this is written with the Sumerogram Tsu, meaning, well, precisely teeth. And then in the next line, we likewise find the teeth in his mouth. And this is, I think, sort of insistent. In a marked fashion, it speaks about the teeth of Kumarbi. It's as if the teeth are important in Kumarbi. This is slender evidence, one might say, but I would cautiously suggest that Kumarbi is connected with teeth. And then I found another indication, and here's where the imposter thing, but again, I'm not even pretending. Because there is an incantation in Hurrian from Mari, which has been published by Campbell and Fisher a couple of years ago, and this is an incantation against toothache. And in the text we hear the tooth wails, the tooth sounds out, they, that is the teeth, cry out to Mother Pidengi, to Father Kumarbi. And I can't read this, but I do recognize what must be an Akkadian loan word, namely shinnum, which means tooth. So there is a tooth, and it is it's insistently about the teeth, and this incantation is directed to Kumarbi. We could then cautiously suggest that there is a connection between Kumarbi and teeth. And again, Campbell and Fisher say that the connection of Pidengi, Shalosh, and Kumarbi, both chthonic deities associated with grain, to teeth is unclear. But if there is an association between Kronos' predecessor in Anatolia, Kumarbi, and teeth, then it actually makes sense. And then that is a sort of explanation why Kronos sickle is tooth. Now, I wouldn't say, again, I first wrote, when I composed this presentation, I wrote, is this the reason? And then I thought, no, it's not the reason, because it's not the reason, because there's not no one reason. But I think this is one reason to believe that Kronos sickle may in fact be toothed, because there are historical models for this. One historical model in Greek societies would be the experiences of people such as a farmer like Hesiod himself, of dog's teeth and sickles. But then further back, there might be a mythical model where a certain god had used not a toothed sickle, but a toothed jaw, his own teeth, in order to emasculate that god. In that case, I think that there is good reason to believe that it makes perfect sense for Kronos sickle to be toothed. Now, you might wonder what happened to the obsidian. Now, I'm not sure about the obsidian argument at all, but I will playfully, without issuing any apologies, well, I just did. I will playfully suggest one thing. When in the Kumarbi text, Kumarbi wants to eat his child, and he puts the stone into his mouth, and he bites the stone. Then he puts together two different semirograms. If a person able to read this text would see those semirograms, na, meaning stone, and tsu, meaning teeth, then there is the possibility that that person would have connected them, and na, tsu actually means either flint or precisely obsidian. If that is the case, then it is at least possible that the Hittite scribe or a Hittite reader or someone at some point thought about stones and teeth and connected them, because stone tooth was in fact obsidian. I'm not, how shall I put it, very confident about this interpretation. What I am more confident about is that there seems to be a concatenation of categories in the Greek sources between teeth, sickles, dogs, sharks, and adamant, and the curved shape. And in the future, I hope to be able to explore this, to explore this concatenation and to try to make sense of it better than I did today. That's the work for the future, and I'm very happy that I was invited here, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Thanks so much.